Everybody, it's been a little break since I had my last Father Gregory Shorts. In these particular 5-minute sessions, we're looking at contemporary topics, and I welcome and encourage people who have access to my timeline or my YouTube channel to contribute topics. One that's recently been contributed quotes Matthew 26:11, in which Jesus says, "You have the poor with you always." Notice he does not say you will always have the poor. He says you have the poor with you always. Now, of course, he's speaking to a particular generation, particular time, and in a particular place. Therefore, we cannot extract from this the idea that poverty is inevitable. But he is contrasting the situation of always having the poor with you with the fact that his disciples will not always have him with them, prior, of course, to the resurrection in the events that lead up to the Passion. However, it does obviously, from a Christian point of view, raise the question about whether not only that we will always have the poor with us, but whether they will always be the poor to be alongside with us. That's a nice and subtle distinction, but an important one. How do we define poverty? Poverty, generally speaking, across many different definitions, is recognized to be an inability of individuals or groups to sustain basic human needs. That's, of course, in terms of food, security, accommodation, and so on and so forth. Poverty, however, is often been addressed in a relative term, as a relative term to some sort of benchmark, some sort of acceptable minimal standard of living, and that, of course, is notoriously difficult to define. But let's move on and let's consider, as many have done across the ages, and particularly in the modern era, the different stages of economic development of humankind, and see if there we can discover some sort of pattern or growth or development that might illuminate this vitally important question of poverty. I shall use the term poverty gradient, in other words, to distinguish between absolute poverty, relative poverty, and absence of poverty. Okay? So let's start with hunter-gatherer societies. People on the move, nomadic groups, living off the land, killing game, and so on and so forth. These groups still exist today, but are very much a minority in terms of global demographics. Equality, economic equality, of course this is the measure of poverty. Economic equality is defined by environmental opportunity. Where will we find that next deer to hunt? Where will we find those luscious fruits to gather? So it's a poverty gradient which is transient and minimal. As seasons change, as the environment changes, as the ability to seek out new hunting grounds changes in relation to the environment, poverty there is strictly environmental and only limited by human inventiveness and skill in seeking out new environments when old ones perish in terms of food value. The second stage in human economic development is the domestication of animals. This is where nomadic groups learn that it is useful to gather a limited number of animals around them. This is initially in order to provide protection. This is the domestication of the wolf into the dog that guarded the camp while people were out hunting. And then later, of course, the recognition that you could domesticate other animals for food. So that is where hunting gives way to the domestication of animals and perhaps even selling the meat of animals to nearby groups, primarily still nomadic with their herds, with their flocks, when there are shortages. So wealth here is measured in terms of the trade value of animal surpluses. The poverty gradient here is generational and moderate, by which I mean that wealth may exist so long as a family is able to maintain its flocks and its herds and bequeath them to the next generation. Generational gradient of poverty. The third stage in human economic development is the domestication of wheat, and this started, we know, in the Middle East and spread throughout the world, but in other places no doubt it had other starting points. The domestication of wheat promoted the growth of towns, of cities even, urbanization as we call it now. And within those towns, no longer dependent on hunting or gathering, or even on the personal garnering of livestock, the diversification of trades. So specialization comes into the human economic factor of labor. Some people work in farms and they sell their produce in towns as villages and cities, and that enables others living in those urban areas to develop their skills in areas other than farming. So part of the paradox of the agrarian, the farming revolution, is that it promotes the next stage on the journey through technological innovation to the industrial revolution. Now, in the agrarian revolution, we see here wealth being generated in cities and promoting the emergence of a political class based on economic power. You obviously then get a monarchy of some sort, and the principle of generational succession from a monarch, and of course the succession of the wealth that goes with it. So there is a politicization of economic power and a tendency of those in power in monarchical societies to retain their position through the accumulation of wealth, and so we now see the poverty gradient increasing significantly. The next stage, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, and here we see technology developing in urban areas to start with, replacing what were formerly cottage industries in rural areas, people moving away from the land even at a greater and faster rate into urban areas as the Industrial Revolution promotes technological innovation, and the products and the markets, the finance and the wealth that go with that increase. But the poverty gradient here is now severe, very often in many places, and into the modern era on a global scale. I'm just going to glance to the side, to my right, to quote to you some statistics. In 2019, most people on this planet lived in poverty. Purchasing power parity in dollars, 85% live on less than $30 a day, 2/3 live on less than $10 a day, and 10% live on less than $1.50 per day, which of course is extreme and absolute poverty. So at the same time that wealth is being generated by technological innovation, but also in many societies where wealth is not distributed through taxation, those wealth disparities continue to grow and the poverty gradient indeed becomes severe. Equality, that is economic equality, now tends to be only in societies where there is a common consent that there shall be a redistribution of wealth, often through taxation, or indeed in small niche areas like Switzerland and elsewhere. No doubt there are poor in Switzerland as well, but these are places where there is relatively higher wealth and a much less severe poverty gradient. But for most of the human species at this time, poverty is endemic and difficult to address without severe reform. And of course this is what prompted many socialist revolutions through the 19th and 20th centuries and into the current era, the attempt by the state to dismantle the capitalist system. And of course one of the problems with this, of course, is the collapse of communism in Russia and effectively in China, albeit in a one-party state, is that the Marxist model does not produce goods necessarily for people across the economic poverty gradient. Far from it. Of course, in Soviet Russia, there still existed a hierarchy of economic privilege between the political class and, of course, the workers. The current era has been the development of the arguably fifth, perhaps we might say, information revolution, and this is where the existing technological developments are driven at an even further and faster pace by access to, control of, and indeed even sale of information and the networks, the technological networks, the internet and so on and so forth, upon which that is grounded and based. And of course now the poverty gradient is still high, but it's now defined by those who are in and out of the information network and indeed information control. For information control is also an aspect of power. And of course the beneficiaries of this information technological revolution have been corporate entities such as Google, such as Microsoft, such as Amazon and others, who have been able to benefit through the mass marketing of information access in different markets. But again, that is still limited by those who are at the poor end of access both to goods, investment and wealth itself. So back to the original question. Is it true that not only the poor you have with you always, as Jesus said, but you do not always have me? But is it also correspondingly true that we will always have the poor? Well, I think there will always be a poverty gradient of sorts. Even hunter-gatherers have a poverty gradient between groups based on environmental opportunity. But whether the human and aspect of political and economic dispossession, alienation of people permanently almost locked into poverty by lack of access to wealth and to generation of wealth within their own communities, whether that is inevitable, I seriously doubt. Therefore, Christians must strive with all those who have influence and power to dismantle structures that are inimical to basic human needs of food, of shelter, of security, of accommodation, and of flourishing in the human domain. How we get there, how we address those endemic and systemic disparities of wealth and its distribution is perhaps a topic for ongoing debate and action. And so, glory be to God.